He's been racist and xenophobic. He's been discriminatory. He's fueled hate.
In September 1969, my father, Reverend Harvey Peters, a Lutheran minister in suburban Detroit, welcomed Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. into our church to preach to our congregation. Dr. King's son had been assassinated the year before. My dad had spent the late 60s as president of an interfaith clergy group that organized to break the segregationist housing covenants that kept black families and Jewish families out of neighborhoods like Southfield and Lathrop. He and a colleague once posed as a Jewish couple to document a realtor steering them to predetermined neighborhoods. They circulated petitions, they wrote curriculum for school teachers, they proposed an open housing ordinance that was eventually adopted. My three sisters and I sat in the front row at Sunday worship and got the church giggles like usual, but we also learned something. We learned that the right to live where you want, the right to send your kids to a decent school, the right to walk to a polling place and cast a ballot, none of that was handed down from the sky. Somebody had to fight for it, often someone whose name nobody remembers. That's why I serve in Congress, and it's why I asked the Attorney General of California to come on this show today, because the same fight is happening right now. There's a bill in Congress called the SAVE Act, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. It would require every American to produce documentary proof of citizenship in person every time they register to vote or update their registration. Sounds reasonable until you look at the numbers. About 146 million American citizens do not have a valid passport. The Brennan Center estimates that roughly 21 million voting-age Americans don't have ready access to a birth certificate, passport, or naturalization certificate. About 84% of married women change their last name, which means tens of millions of women have a birth certificate that does not match their current legal name. And the problem this is supposedly solving? In 2020, the Associated Press reviewed every potential voter fraud case in the 6 battleground states Donald Trump disputed, 25.5 million votes cast, and found fewer than 475 instances. Utah just finished a citizenship review of its entire voter roll, more than 2 million voters, and found exactly one confirmed case of non-citizen registration, 0 non-citizen votes. I'm Scott Peters. I represent California's 50th Congressional District, and this is 72 and Sunny, where we have the conversations that matter about the issues shaping our region and our country. If you like what you hear, subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts. Recently, the United States Supreme Court issued a 6-3 decision in Louisiana versus Calais. They struck down Louisiana's congressional map, and they functionally rewrote Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the section that has been the federal floor against racially discriminatory voting maps for 60 years. Justice Kagan, in dissent, called it a decision that all but renders Section 2 all but a dead letter. That ruling stands on top of an active Senate fight over the SAVE Act, on top of a series of executive orders trying to nationalize election rules, and on top of a constitutional amendment that just qualified for the November ballot in California. We are not in an abstract conversation about voting rights. We are in the middle of one. My guest today is Rob Bonta, the Attorney General of California. He's the first Filipino-American to hold that office. He grew up in a trailer at the United Farm Workers headquarters, and he spent the last year leading coalitions of state attorneys general against the SAVE Act, suing the federal government over executive orders that try to take voter rolls away from states, and defending private enforcement of the Voter Rights Act in front of the Supreme Court. We're going to talk today about what the law actually says, what's happening in the courts right now, and what changed with the Calais decision, and why both of us think this fight matters. Rob, welcome. Hey, Rob, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. You are the 34th Attorney General of the state of California. I think it must be a pretty cool job. I will say you're a Yale Law graduate, and you're doing more credit to the Yale Law School than the vice president and some other folks in Washington, D.C. So
Appreciate it.
Congratulations for that. So today I want to talk about civil rights and some of the threats to voting rights that we're seeing coming out of Washington and what your response is in California. I would just say from a large perspective that, because things are so tough in California for civil rights and for the things we care about, your role as Attorney General and your colleagues across the country who fight these battles, you're really on the front lines. And I want to thank you for the work and for all the attorneys and the people that work for you to put up that fight while we try to get things right and things more balanced in Washington, D.C. So thanks again for that.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Scott.
But you have a story, a farm worker story. So why don't you tell me about your background and your your parents, their own struggle in civil rights.
Absolutely. And we are all products of our family legacies, our missions of service that our families have handed down to us. I'm proud of that. With respect to my own family, both my mom and dad had experiences and I was able to share some of them, some parts of them, with my parents that have impacted me and really led me on the path that I'm on. And for my dad, he grew up in Ventura County. He was the first person in his family to go to a 4-year college after graduating from community college. He went to Cal, Berkeley. And then my mom is an immigrant from the Philippines. She grew up in the Philippines. She was a child of war. She was a child in the Philippines when Japan occupied the Philippines. Her family fled to the countryside to avoid being imprisoned and harmed. Her school was transformed into a torture chamber, and just harrowing stories of growing up a child of war. They met in Berkeley, California in 1965. My mom came to California on an ecumenical scholarship to study at the Pacific School of Religion, and my father was entering PSR after graduating from Cal. And it was Berkeley, California in 1965, and it was a time of demanding that our country be better, that our union be more perfect, that we be more just and more fair. And my dad had a friend across the country in Alabama who was sending him audio cassette tapes in the mail of the voice of a leader. His friend said to him, "You need to hear this person's message and hear him speak." And it ended up being the recorded voice of Martin Luther King Jr. And my father listened to these tapes. He tore open these packages, put them in the tape player. To all your young listeners, an audio cassette tape is an old technology that records sound like a digital file. And he felt a call to action to go to Selma, Alabama, and to be part of something bigger than himself, of this fight for justice, of making our country more fair and more just. And so jumped on an Amtrak train, traveled for 3 days, arrived in Selma, Alabama, met Stokely Carmichael when he was there. He was in Brown Chapel AME Church when it was announced that Martin Luther King Jr. would be delivering a sermon to the congregation. So he sat in church and listened to Martin speak in Selma in the 1960s, in the middle of the civil rights movement. And he stayed on there for many weeks, organizing for civil rights, for voting rights. And of course, that was a formative moment in his life, and a formative moment in our family legacy. My parents later went to the Philippines and served as missionaries. When I was born, they had a really tough decision to make, which was, can we raise our son here and my older sister, their daughter, and guarantee that we had the things that were non-negotiable, that we had democracy and freedom and the rule of law and human rights and due process. And unfortunately, the answer at that time was no. A dictator was rising to power. Martial law was around the corner. Ferdinand Marcos was coming, and democracy was on its last legs and in its last breaths. And so, to ensure that I had those things, my parents brought me to California, and they were right. As they left the Philippines in that wake, the dictator rose to power. Democracy ended. Free and fair elections were over. And that was unacceptable for them, for me, and for our family. So, and they also knew that once we were in California, you can't just put your chin on your elbow, look out the window, hope, and wait for the things that you want. You got to go fight for them. You got to go work for them. So they started working for the United Farm Workers of America. They started in LA as part of the lettuce boycott. They gathered signatures outside of supermarkets as part of that effort. Later invited to go to the headquarters of La Paz. And so our family moved there, and we lived in a trailer. My younger brother joined us when we were there. He was born in Bakersfield, and my parents organized for a fair contract, for fair and safe working conditions, for things like shade breaks and water breaks and bathroom breaks for the workers who were feeding our state, feeding our nation. And I realized that people from without fancy titles or enormous wealth, who come together, committed to a common goal, and a fight for justice, can do anything and accomplish anything. And that farm worker movement was a proof positive of that.
And what a great example. I think that's how it's always been. I was honored to serve with John Lewis for a short time in Congress before he passed away. And he would talk about those days, and he would assure us that no, it wasn't Jim Crow. It's not the same as it was. It's better. But I think in this Trump administration, that there's been a resurgence of hatred, and I just sort of like to see, like, what do you think? To me, he sort of gave permission to people to say really ugly things to each other, people that maybe we understood were wrong before, or we understood, people understood even if they felt that way, they would never say them. And now I think it's the gates have been kind of opened up, and I think hatred has been on the rise. I think anti-Semitism, racism are resurgent. I would be interested in your perspective on that. Like, what does that look like from your perspective, and what do you see as the new coalitions of people coming back to push back on that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think this president has given permission, given license, given encouragement to hate, to scapegoating, to blaming other people for the things that you're not happy with in your life, and to target them and to vilify them. He's been racist and xenophobic. He's been discriminatory. He's fueled hate instead of unifying our country and our people. Diversity, of course, is the great strength of our country. It is our secret sauce, our X factor. It makes us strong. It makes us great, particularly so in California. And he has, politics can be emotional. The emotions he likes to tap into are fear and anger, and he promotes them with hate and divisiveness. And I wouldn't say it's particularly working. He's got the lowest poll numbers he's ever had, as we speak. But it's dangerous, and it's wrong, and it's not who we are. And it is incumbent upon us, leaders, of course, who have the honor and privilege of serving their people, to step up and stand up and push back and fight for something different. But also, everyday people. They are who is going to decide where we go from here, and we need to reject this notion that we will discriminate, that we will exclude, that we will target, that we will hurt and harm people based on where they're from, how they look, who they love, how they pray. We cannot have that. That's not who we are. That is the worst of us, not the best of us. So we need to rise back to the best of us. And I think what you're doing, what the people are doing, with 8 million people coming out on No King's Day and saying, we reject this leadership and these values. We demand something better and something more. That's what we need.
Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about voter suppression and what's going on with the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act purports to be a voter ID measure that would require you to show proof of identity before you vote. And we understand, by the way, from polling, that concept is pretty popular. The idea is that, you should be able to show that you're actually the person who's on the voter roll. That makes sense. This goes way beyond that. How deep are you at looking into what the SAVE Act is doing or proposing, and what do you want to say about that?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate to have a level of identification affirmation when voting. We have that in California. So the details matter, and the Save America Act is something, and its predecessor, the SAVE Act, are two quote unquote solutions in search of a problem. They purport to address widespread voter fraud, which does not exist, which every count and recount and hand count and audit and court case has found it doesn't exist. It is a myth. It's a figment of the imagination of Donald Trump, a conspiracy theorist. He promotes it, from the State of the Union address and other places, and his followers unfortunately believe him. So
let's get to the draconian solution. But since you brought it up, I brought the receipts on voter fraud in the United States. Utah did a citizenship review of its entire voter registration list from April 25 through 26. Out of 2 million registered voters, they identified one confirmed instance of a non-citizen registration and 0 instances of non-citizen voting. Kansas passed the photo ID law, okay? And that was much more generous than the SAVE Act, which we'll get to. You could use your driver's license, you could use your military ID, you could use a passport. Before the law took effect, non-citizen registration in Kansas accounted for about 0.002% of registered voters. After adoption, the documentary proof requirement prevented 31,000 eligible citizens, 12% of all applicants, from registering to vote. California has had 71 cases of voter fraud since 1982 out of 339 million ballots cast. You'll need a calculator to show you that is 0.00002%. And you see similar results from the Heritage Foundation, which is a widely known, very conservative organization that found almost no voter fraud in all the swing states. For instance, in the last 30 years in Pennsylvania, 39 reported cases of fraud out of over 100 million ballots cast, similar from Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, or North Carolina, Wisconsin. So it is a problem that doesn't exist. It's a solution looking for a problem. I also think it's fair to point out right now that today it's already illegal to vote if you're not a citizen. We forget it's against the law today, okay? So now let's go to the SAVE Act and the Save America Act, which will require you to basically produce proof of citizenship to register to vote. You could do that with a passport, which about 50% of Americans don't have.
Right.
Or you could do it with your birth certificate, which I think 80% of women change their name when they get married. So they have to go back and find, I don't know where my birth certificate is. Maybe my mom has it in New Jersey, but I don't know where it is. I do have a passport, I guess, but you'd force these people to go back to prove that the name on their driver's license or passport is the same as what's in their birth certificate. I mean, it is nuts. It is really meant to disenfranchise people. Isn't that right?
It is. And, these are the outcome, the upshot, and perhaps the goal is to suppress voting, to disenfranchise, the requirement of in-person proof of citizenship with a passport or a birth certificate that immediately prevents millions of Americans from voting who are eligible today. And this is, a fundamental right, the right from which all other rights flow. And the Save America Act seeks to remove people who have that right from that right. And you're right about half of Americans do not have the passport. About 69 million married people change their name, so it's different than their birth certificate. About 60 million live in rural areas where it's very difficult to go in person to a federal office to present their birth certificate or their passport. So suppression is the outcome, and voter suppression is the goal. And it is very dangerous and unnecessary to solve any problem, because there is no evidence of any problem that it can address.
Right. And the bill, the Save America Act, you're correct, is the precise act we're talking about, passed in February in the House by 218 to 213 with one Democrat crossing over. And now we're waiting for the Senate. Because of the filibuster rules, they need 7 Democrats to agree, unless the Republicans decide to abandon the filibuster and just allow a majority vote, which we are hoping that they are resistant. I must tell you, I think that so many of the Republicans are really hoping this doesn't pass because of the disruption it would cause. And they love to have voted yes for it in the House, but they're hoping the Republicans don't pass it, because if they do, we'll be in a real mess. And I guess that leads me to I want to talk at some length about your role in this and the litigation that you're facing. You don't have to worry quite now about the Save America Act until it passes. Well, let's talk more about the Calais case. Why don't you, as our constitutional law professor, explain what Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act does, how Calais changed it, and why, if you agree with me, it set us back 60 years in many ways with respect to voting rights.
Perhaps the most meaningful law to protect the rights of voters to be free of unlawful discrimination in exercising their right to vote. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act allows for when there is evidence of voter dilution of a racial minority in a district, to redistrict that district so that it can be majority or minority. And that was put before the U.S. Supreme Court in the Calais case, and they struck down the ability to do that. They didn't completely strike down Section 2, but they, as I think it was Justice Kagan in her dissent said, they rendered it essentially meaningless. And so, and we've seen the different Republican governors in different states jumping at the opportunity to weaponize this new ruling and redistrict, including in Louisiana itself, the governor calling off the election that was already in progress.
In the middle of an election, votes being cast.
Votes were already cast.
Yeah.
And so unbelievable, so that they can redistrict based on Calais. And the United States Supreme Court actually took an unprecedented or very rare action of quickly implementing their decision with the usually they have to send down their decision to the district court, and that takes 30 plus days, and there's an opportunity for the parties to take action in between time, but they essentially sped it up on purpose.
Well, and they usually announce these decisions often in June at the end, right? You have to think they put this one out early because they wanted it to affect these elections.
Which is unfortunate, and I hate to think that about our U.S. Supreme Court, but we have to observe the facts as we see them. And there have been some good moments where the U.S. Supreme Court, even made taking clear positions against tariffs, against National Guard, supported Prop 50, California's Prop 50, but also moments like this where it's very disappointing. Not just disappointing; it's very harmful for the future of our democracy and for the voices of racial minority voters.
Do you want to talk about those executive orders and the Watson case and so forth?
Yeah, happy to. So the president has issued 2 executive orders trying to impact elections nationwide. There was an initial executive order that attempted to impose different voter restrictions, including a voter ID requirement, and also a requirement that Watson actually addresses around ballots that were timely cast on or before Election Day, not counting if they arrive after Election Day. And we immediately got an order blocking that unlawful executive order. We continued to have an injunction preventing its application. Basically, the court has said the president does not have the authority to issue such an order. This authority belongs to the states and to Congress. He later issued another executive order a few weeks ago where he is trying to create a citizenship list throughout the nation, requiring states to provide information to the federal government, and then having that list essentially act as a filter at the United States, in the United States Postal Service, a independent agency, by the way, to filter out what they determined to be vote by mail ballots going to ineligible voters. And we filed a motion for summary judgment in that case. We think we're going to be able to block that executive order as well. It's also clearly unconstitutional in that the executive branch is trying to use the authority that belongs to the states and to Congress. And then the Watson case is a U.S. Supreme Court case which will determine this issue of what is Election Day. Can ballots cast on or before Election Day by mail, but that arrive after, be counted, or are only the ballots that arrive by Election Day the ones that can be counted? And I think there's different perspectives about how that U.S. Supreme Court oral argument went. I think some people think that ballots that arrive after Election Day will not be counted. Some other viewers and analysts think that they still might be able to be counted. In California, if they arrive within 7 days after Election Day, vote by mail ballots, they're eligible to be counted. So
as long as they're postmarked by Election Day.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? Yeah, right.
Oh, postmarked on or before Election Day.
Right. And so how does that square with the notion that states make their own rules? Is that, I mean, how, so is if they rule against California, for instance, and require that votes received after Election Day that were postmarked by Election Day, cast before Election Day, are not to be counted, how does that square with, what does that do to our assumption that states make the rules?
Right. This is the part where Congress has a role to play too. And so the interpretation is of the term Election Day. The Watson decision will apply only to general elections, so not primary elections, and only general elections where there's a federal election on the ballot. So, a presidential is one, and, as you know, as a Congress member, every general election every 2 years, there's federal officers seeking election or reelection.
Congress only gets a 2-year contract. That's all we get.
That's right. So it's because of the election day term in federal law, and so that's how that's why this is before the U.S. Supreme Court and on this issue of federal elections that are general elections, and it's sort of the shared authority of both Congress and the state to determine the time, place, and manner.
So I guess one other legal issue I'd want to raise with you is, since the deployment of National Guard and federal troops to cities, United States cities, and by the way, we've funded ICE and Customs Enforcement and Border Patrol to a level higher than the U.S. Marines, more than the Israeli military, all to be turned against our own cities and our own people. We're fighting over funding for them right now, but they have $150 billion not spent from the big, beautiful bill. One of the concerns that a lot of my constituents have raised to me is that this is a prelude to interfering with elections on the ground. And I wonder what you're thinking about that, and if you have any advice for us in D.C. how to respond, or if you've thought about how you would want to make sure that that's not what we're looking at in October and November.
National Guard in particular?
Yeah.
Well, we had a big battle in California, of course, with respect to the deployment of the National Guard. It started, unfortunately, the series of National Guard deployments to Democratic cities by this Trump administration started in L.A. About a year ago, and we fought tooth and nail to get the National Guard out of our city. We thought they were unlawfully deployed and federalized, and we also thought they were engaged in activities, civilian law enforcement that's prohibited by the Posse Comitatus Act. So, the notion of National Guard in American cities or military in American cities is anathema to who we are. It's part, in our founding, we've rejected that notion that we shall not have that. But I mentioned Trump's polling numbers earlier, not to take a cheap shot, but to create a context, which is that a desperate Trump is a dangerous Trump. He's dangerous always, more so when he's desperate. And if he sees that the only way to win an election is by lying, cheating, and stealing, suppressing the vote, or deploying the military, or interfering with vote by mail through the U.S. Postal Service, he may very well do it. So we are prepared for all the possibilities. We're doing table-topping exercises, preparing for what might happen. We do expect military to be the possibility. We have to be prepared for it, the possibility that they will be at the polls. So it's already, just like it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote, it's already illegal for the military to be at the polls. That's federal law. That's not a state law. That's a federal law. And you can't be armed and have military at the polls for obvious reasons. It intimidates people, it suppresses the right to vote. And so we're ready to secure court orders immediately. Should ICE, National Guard, the Marines, and the Marines I say the Marines because they were deployed to California last June, if they show up near polls and seek to suppress the vote that way.
I don't know if people, regular folks who just go to the polls to vote, understand. Like, you're not even allowed to electioneer. You can't even have a campaign sign near a polling place.
That's right.
And so we are very, very protective of that physical space for people to go vote and feel unintimidated. I think, just to add to what you said, not who we are, the notion that we would have armed people at the polls would just scare the hell out of people. And I think, exactly, in California, we're proud to have more people vote. We bend over backwards to count people's votes, to help them vote. We register online. We register at the DMV. We want everybody participating in this democracy. And you see with Trump, if we do go to this way, and I believe it, he is a caged animal. He's very, very angry and he ironically, he gets a sense of powerlessness when he can't control everything. I do think, we've seen a lot of irrational actions. It's not out of the question.
Not at all. And we have to be ready for it. And we are. And unfortunately, we expect it. Prop 50, to your point about sort of socializing different ideas, Fulton County was socializing the idea of seizing ballots. In Georgia, the US DOJ deployed monitors to California in our last November for a state-only Prop 50 election where there was only one thing on the ballot. And, they had federal monitors at different polling sites. And so we put our own observers at those to observe their monitors to make sure there was no funny business happening. But they are socializing this idea of, having military in our cities, seizing ballots, having federal monitors at the polls. And it could escalate and increase either this June or November.
All, ostensibly justified by the concept of voter fraud, the concern about voter fraud, which we've proven is non-existent.
Right.
But it is the case that judges around the country are standing up and doing the right thing in a way that people should have some confidence in. And I think, as much as we're concerned about the Supreme Court, a lot of the lower courts are hanging in there and doing the people's work and protecting the Constitution. I think they deserve a little credit. Is that kind of how you see it too?
100%. I mean, and there's so many places for hope and optimism here. One of us is our courageous judges who are calling it like they see it, who are hanging tough, doing their job in the midst of attacks and insults and being called activist judges and calls for their impeachment and being called so-called judges by Trump when he doesn't like the outcome. And they have been, Scott, very noticeably passionate in their remarks and their writing. They say things like, "We're a system of checks and balances, but the only check that Trump wants is a blank one."
That's a good line.
Yeah, it's a great line. A Trump appointee said, "We're a nation of constitutional law, not martial law." And these are truths that you would expect don't have to be said, especially about the president of the United States. So these judges aren't just courageously calling it like they see it, allowing the chips fall where they may, but they are not happy. They're almost angry and offended by the lawlessness of the Trump administration.
It is offensive. When you and I went to law school, we learned the Supreme Court was above politics, and we learned. We were very, I don't know. I always felt when I went to court, I felt the judge was to be respected, and that the judge was sort of the legal system before me. And I think that's how they saw it. That's why those people are judges, often making far less money than they could make in the private sector. Right. And, on a time clock that, in practice, you don't have to be on. And so I think we owe them a lot of gratitude and thanks.
I agree.
So going forward, I guess we'll fight in the Senate to make sure they don't pass that law. We are going to try to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which, remember, the Voting Rights Act struck down essentially, effectively by Calais, is a product of Congress. Mm-hmm. And we can redeem that if we can. That will take some luck in the elections for us to get to a point where we can pass that. We just want to thank you for putting up this strong legal defense and strong legal advocacy for our civil rights and for the Constitution, because gosh knows it's not coming out of D.C. like we'd like to see it. So thank you very much for it. Any final thoughts you have about the importance of this in this moment in our history? Back in the Constitution, 250 years in, we've had a lot of fights for our democracy over the course of our history. And people have died for our democracy over the course of our history. I think we're in another one of those moments where I tell people I speak to, you're not entitled to the democracy. You have to fight for it.
Right.
And I think that's where we are. And thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you. I 100% agree that this is a moment where we need to fight to defend what we've, our progress, our gains, and fight to protect our democracy. No democracy is guaranteed. But I will say that this is guaranteed. If we fight, our leaders, our people, we will protect our democracy. So it's incumbent upon, the folks listening to this podcast, the folks that are that create our citizenry, to stay engaged, stay enraged about the offensive abuses of power of the president. We can never accept the unacceptable, never normalize what's so abnormal, and we need to meet this moment and rise to the occasion. We are being asked to do more. So I asked my team to do more. I'm proud of my team at the Department of Justice, the Democratic AGs that we work with. We're proud to be on the front lines, protecting rights and freedoms, the rule of law, keeping the president within the boundaries of his given authority and never allowing him to exercise authority that's not his. And people power is the most potent power that there is. So we need to keep fighting. If we fight, I know we will succeed, and but we need to stay engaged and stay committed. And we should never feel hopeless, because we're not helpless. We have a ton of power and authority to write the next chapter in the story of this country and the story of our state. And you, me, us, we, the people are going to write that story. So I feel I'm very actually hopeful and optimistic, Scott, about what happens next. I'm optimistic about the midterms, both the primary and the general. I'm optimistic about where we've come, and since the inauguration day, we continue to make progress in this ongoing fight. We're still in some dark times, but I do see a bright light at the end of that tunnel here if we keep fighting. And please know I will keep fighting. I know you will too, and I know all your listeners will as well.
We're a great country. We're not defined by Trump. We're defined by our people. So thank you for the fight. That's a great call to arms, and I think we'll leave it at that. Rob Bonta, Attorney General of California, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Congressmember. Honored to be with you.
Thank you, Rob Bonta. You have been doing the work in the courts, while a lot of us in Congress have been doing it on the floor and in committee. We need both, and we need each other. Here's what I hope you're taking away from this. First, federal law already prohibits non-citizen voting. It has since 1996. The penalties include prison and deportation. This is not a problem in search of a solution. It is a solution in search of a problem. Second, the data is overwhelming. Documented voter fraud is virtually non-existent. The 21 million Americans who would be disenfranchised by the SAVE Act are real. They are our parents, our grandparents, our spouses, our naturalized neighbors. The math here is not close. Third, the Constitution gives the states the authority to run elections, not the president, not the federal executive branch. State attorneys general, led by people like Rob, have been the institutional backbone holding the line in court. Multiple federal courts have blocked Trump's election executive orders. The Department of Justice has lost dozens of times trying to seize voter data. Fourth, when the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in Louisiana versus Calais, they struck down Louisiana's congressional map and rewrote what plaintiffs have to prove under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Justice Kagan said in dissent that the ruling renders Section 2 all but a dead letter. My response was simple. Today's ruling takes us 60 years backwards. Congress must step in and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to ensure every American has an equal voice in our democracy. If you want to learn more about what California's Department of Justice is doing on voting rights, visit oag.ca.gov, G-O-V. And if this conversation moved you, here's what you can do this week. Call your senators about the Save America Act, whatever their party, whatever their politics. Tell them federal law already prohibits non-citizen voting and that this bill would disenfranchise eligible citizens to address a problem that does not at all exist. Tell them to bring the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to a floor vote. Volunteer with a local voter registration drive. Help a family member or a neighbor get their registration up to date. And for those of us in California, this fight is now on our November ballot. A constitutional amendment authored by San Diego Assembly member Carl DeMaio has qualified to appear on the ballot in November 2026. It would require government-issued IDs at the poll and the last 4 digits of an ID number on mail ballots. We'll have more to say about that measure between now and Election Day. For now, read it carefully, look at the data, make your own decision. Michael from CA50. Michael from California 50 asked, what's something about San Diego that still surprises you? Michael, the thing about San Diego that's intangible, but it's really profound, is the culture of collaboration here. People work together here naturally. I always say that the biggest difference between Washington and San Diego is the culture, because in San Diego, we see tomorrow as an opportunity. You see collaboration in various businesses. You see it in biotechnology. You see the Navy and the port cooperating. You see the hospitals coordinating about disaster response and about public health. It's our natural way, and I've probably taken that for granted if I hadn't gone to Washington, where you see the culture is very competitive. It's very us versus you. It's very zero sum, and it's very backward looking and grudge holding. And that you just don't see that in San Diego. That's why we're such a good place for innovation and for problem solving. I think it might have something to do with the military being part of our culture. Those folks, go to work and they solve problems and figure out how to get things done. But in any event, it's remarkable here. With everything people say about the weather, with everything, with all the great advantages we have, I think the culture is one that still surprises me, and it's just so productive and inspiring. Frankie from San Diego asks, are you YIMBY or NIMBY? Why is it still so hard to build housing in this country? Frankie, I'm a YIMBY. I helped found the YIMBY Democrats back in the day, and when I was on the city council, I was trying to get the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, reformed, because at every step, people could file lawsuits, and it really kept us from building the housing stock that we needed, in addition to zoning and everything else. And so, for a lot of time now, California and San Diego has depressed the production of housing. Supply has not kept up with demand. And the cost of housing is now, I think, the biggest threat to the continued prosperity of the Golden State and San Diego. It's very hard to recruit here, if you can imagine, whether you're in academia or business or a nonprofit. And it's very hard for young people to afford to live here. So we need to build more houses. Now, we need to do that in a way that preserves what makes our community great. But I think we can do that. I think you see examples where all over town, you take empty buildings and you take surface parking lots and you turn them into housing. It's all to the good for the neighborhoods. I think we need to break down sort of zoning restrictions at the local level. We've asked our institutions to do more like the military and universities, housing people on site. We'll have to deal with transportation issues, but we just installed a huge trolley extension from downtown up to the major employment areas at UCSD and UTC. I had a big part in that. But if we don't confront this housing issue, I think we're really in for a decline, and I don't think that's what we want. So at the federal level, we can provide incentives. I did sponsor a bill, which I think will be adopted this year, called Build More Housing Near Transit. It says if you want to compete for our big transit money for your big transit project, show us what housing you're building next to it as part of the competition. We want to change building codes to make it easier to build manufactured housing. We want to set an example through faith-based housing. My bill, Faith and Housing Act, would allow religious institutions to build housing on their parking lots as part of their mission. We need to do everything we can. It's all hands on deck to get more housing built and to make sure that over time we see a reduction in the price. Whatever fight is in front of us right now, the SAVE Act, the executive orders, the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court, the November ballot in California, that is the work in front of us. If a parish minister with a young family could do it 60 years ago, we can do it now. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.